They told her humans came from a world that should have killed them before they learned to walk. The station rotated in absolute silence, a ring of cold alloy drifting above a gas giant the size of Jupiter, its amber storms crawling across the surface like something alive. And inside Diplomatic Chamber 7, the air was precisely regulated to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity fixed at 40%, gravity tuned to a comfortable 0.8 G for interspecies negotiation. Everything controlled, everything safe, exactly the way Ambassador Lyra Vale preferred it, because in her experience, civilizations that needed comfort were civilizations that had already outgrown chaos, and chaos was what she studied, what she dissected, what she reduced into clean, elegant data, and today's subject stood exactly 3 feet behind her right shoulder, perfectly still, as if carved from something harder than the composite floor beneath him. Human guard Ethan Cole, 6 foot 2 inches, Earthborn, classified origin, Deathworld, and the word still irritated her, not because it was inaccurate, but because it lacked precision, because nothing in her databases fully explained how a species evolved under such hostile parameters without collapsing under its own biological inefficiency. And yet here he stood, breathing evenly, heart rate steady, as if gravity fluctuations, atmospheric instability, and predator density were minor inconveniences rather than extinction-level constants. Human, she said without turning, her voice smooth, analytical. Your planet registers at 1.3 standard gravity, with environmental volatility exceeding 92% of known habitable worlds. How did your species achieve stability? No response, not even a shift in posture. Only the faint hum of the station's life support system threading through the silence. And Lyra's eyes flicked to the transparent display hovering before her, lines of data cascading in soft blue light, oxygen variance, tectonic activity, seasonal extremes measured in lethal thresholds, every metric, pointing to a simple conclusion: survival should have been statistically improbable. You were not engineered, she continued, sharper now, curiosity pressing against her composure. You were not shielded, not guided, not optimized. So what adaptation allowed your kind to persist? Still nothing. And that, more than anything, unsettled her, because every other species she had studied answered questions, eagerly, defensively, arrogantly, but always with words, always with explanation, as if language could justify existence. But this one, this human, remained quiet, and for the first time, Lyra noticed the details she had dismissed before, the subtle tension in his stance, the way his weight distributed evenly despite the lower gravity, the micro-adjustments in balance that suggested his body expected something heavier, harsher, and then the station lights flickered, just once, a brief fluctuation, but enough to trigger a cascade of alerts across her display: pressure variance, structural strain along the outer ring, nothing catastrophic, not yet, but unpredictable, and unpredictability was something her kind eliminated, controlled, erased. Explain, she demanded, turning now, meeting his eyes for the first time, searching for data, for logic, for something she could quantify, and Ethan Cole finally looked back at her, calm, unshaken, as if the warning signals meant nothing at all, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost indifferent. We didn't adapt to survive. A pause, the station groaning softly around them as the distant storm below shifted in. Silent violence. We adapted to keep going, and for reasons she could not immediately define. Ambassador Lyra Vale felt something unfamiliar settle in the space between them, not fear, not yet, but the absence of certainty, and in her world, that was the closest thing to danger. The alert did not escalate to panic, but it lingered, a quiet anomaly threading through the station's perfectly regulated systems, and Lyra did not like anomalies, because anomalies implied variables she could not predict, and prediction was the foundation of every negotiation she had ever won, every system her people had ever stabilized, and yet the data in front of her refused to resolve into something clean. Pressure variance. Holding at a fraction above acceptable limits, structural stress oscillating instead of correcting, as if the station itself was deciding whether to remain stable or not, and behind her Ethan Cole had already moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just one step to the side, repositioning with a precision that did not match the mildness of the situation. His eyes scanning corners of the chamber that her instruments had not flagged, and that unsettled her more than the alert itself. "There is no immediate threat," she stated, more to reaffirm control than to inform him, her fingers gliding across the display as she expanded the sensor range, pulling in external readings from the station's outer hull, micrometeor activity, electromagnetic fluctuations from the gas giant below, radiation drift measured in tight, controlled increments. Everything within acceptable tolerances, everything explainable. And yet he remained focused, as if listening to something beneath the data. "You are reacting to nothing," she added, turning slightly, studying him with sharper intent, because now the question was no longer theoretical, now it was observable, and she needed to understand it. "Your physiology does not indicate heightened sensory capability beyond known parameters, so what are you detecting?" Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the chamber door as another subtle vibration passed through the floor, barely measurable, less than 1/10 of a millimeter shift. Something most species would never notice. Something her instruments only recorded because they were designed to capture perfection. And then he spoke, still calm, still controlled. "Timing." And the word meant nothing to her, not in this context, not in a system governed by synchronized clocks and predictive algorithms. "Timing of what?" she pressed, stepping closer now, the faint glow of the display reflecting in her eyes as the station lights dimmed for half a second before stabilizing again. And Ethan finally turned his head slightly, not enough to face her fully, just enough for his voice to carry with quiet certainty. "Everything." And then it happened, not an explosion, not a catastrophic failure, but a sequence, a cascading delay in system response. The kind of minor misalignment that her people would normally correct before it was even perceived, but here it unfolded just slowly enough to be felt. A door in the adjacent corridor hesitating before sealing, a shift in air circulation that lagged by less than a second, the station's rhythm slipping out of perfect sync, and Lyra's display lit up with overlapping alerts, none critical on their own, but together forming a pattern she had not seen before, a system not failing, but struggling to keep pace with itself. And Ethan moved again, this time without pause, crossing the chamber toward the control panel with a speed that ignored protocol but not purpose, his hand already reaching for a manual override that her species rarely used, because they did not design systems that required instinct. And Lyra felt it then, not fear, not yet, but a realization forming at the edges of her logic, that this human was not responding to the station as it was, but as it was about to be, and for the first time, her voice lost a fraction of its certainty. "How do you know?" And Ethan did not look at her when he answered, his focus entirely on the shifting data, the delayed responses, the imperfect timing that only he seemed to anticipate. "Where I am from," he said quietly. "If something feels off, you do not wait for proof." And the station lights flickered again, longer this time, the hum of the systems dipping before recovering. And Lyra Vale understood, with a clarity that did not come from data, that she was no longer the most prepared mind in the room. The delay spread, subtle but undeniable, like a heartbeat slipping out of rhythm, and Lyra watched the station's systems attempt to correct themselves with increasing urgency, algorithms recalculating, rerouting, compensating, yet always a fraction too late, always chasing something they could not quite predict, and that was when she understood the difference. Her people built systems that prevented failure, but this place, this human-built extension at the edge of controlled space, was enduring it in real time, adapting second by second, and Ethan Cole was already ahead of it, his hand moving across the manual interface with deliberate precision, bypassing automated layers that now lagged behind the unfolding sequence. "You are overriding central control," Lyra said, her voice steady again, but tighter now, recalibrating her authority even as the environment resisted it. "That is unnecessary." But even as she spoke, the display in front of her contradicted her, response times widening by measurable increments, 1/10 of a second, then 2, then 3. Small numbers that meant nothing in isolation but everything in accumulation, and Ethan did not stop, did not argue. He simply adjusted, rerouting power flow through secondary channels, stabilizing pressure in sectors that had not yet registered critical status, acting not on alerts, but on expectation, and that unsettled her more than any visible malfunction. Because he was not reacting to what was happening. He was responding to what would happen next. You are predicting system failure. Without sufficient data, she said, stepping closer. Her eyes locked on his movements, searching for the logic behind them. Because there had to be logic, there always was. But his answer came without hesitation, quiet, almost casual. There is always enough data. Another flicker of light, longer this time, nearly a full second before the chamber restored its illumination, and in that brief dimness Lyra felt the shift again. The station no longer a controlled environment, but a system under strain, and Ethan's voice continued, low and steady. You just have to know what matters. And then the sequence escalated, not violently, not catastrophically, but with a creeping inevitability. A section of the outer ring reported thermal imbalance. Another flagged microfracture stress with intolerances, but trending upward, each alert still individually manageable, still within acceptable limits, but together forming a pattern that her systems could not prioritize fast enough. And for the first time, Lyra did not look at the data. She looked at him, at the way he moved without hesitation, at the way his body aligned with the environment as if it had done this before, many times, in places far less forgiving than this station, where I am from, he said, as if answering the question she had not yet spoken. Nothing fails all at once. His hand paused briefly over the controls, selecting a sequence that cut power to a non-essential sector before it could destabilize the rest, sacrificing efficiency for stability, a choice her people would have calculated only after full analysis. But he made it instantly, without visible calculation. It starts small, he continued, the hum of the station, dipping again as systems rebalanced under his adjustments. A sound, a delay, something just slightly off. Lyra felt her breath slow, her focus narrowing, not on the chamber, not on the alerts, but on the pattern he described, because now she could see it too, not through data, but through progression. And if you wait for confirmation, Ethan finished, finally glancing toward her, his expression unchanged. You are already behind. And the realization settled fully this time, not as uncertainty, but as something sharper, something closer to respect, because this was not a species that survived by eliminating risk. This was a species that lived inside it, moved with it, anticipated it before it became visible. And as the station's systems slowly began to stabilize under his intervention, Lyra Vale understood that what she had mistaken for silence earlier was not absence, it was patience. And patience, in a world like his, was not weakness, it was preparation. The station settled into a fragile rhythm, not perfect, not stable by the standards Lyra was trained to trust, but holding, adapting, compensating in ways that felt almost organic rather than engineered. And she stood there watching the data stream smooth out under Ethan Cole's adjustments, each line of fluctuating numbers gradually aligning into something that resembled control. Though she now understood it was not the kind her people designed, it was something else entirely, something dynamic, something alive in its own way. And for the first time since entering the chamber, she did not reach for the console. She did not override, did not correct, she observed, because interfering now felt like disrupting a balance. She did not fully comprehend. You reduced efficiency by 12%, she said after a moment, her voice measured, analytical, returning to the language she trusted. Your adjustments sacrificed long-term output for short-term stability. Ethan did not look at her, his attention still on the systems, but his response came without hesitation, stability first. Another small shift in the station's hum. Lower now, steadier, the delays tightening back into acceptable margins. Output does not matter if the system cannot hold. Lyra considered that, her mind mapping the logic against centuries of optimization protocols. Every model she had ever worked with prioritized efficiency, maximized output, minimized waste, because in controlled environments, stability was guaranteed. It was assumed, built into every layer of design. But here, on the edge of something less predictable, that assumption no longer held, and the realization unsettled her in a way data never had. Your species, designs for failure, she said quietly, not as accusation, but as observation, and this time Ethan did glance at her, just briefly, before returning his focus to the console. We design for what happens after. The words settled between them, heavier than the alerts that had filled the chamber minutes ago, and Lyra felt the shift again, not in the station, but in her understanding. Because this was not inefficiency. This was a different philosophy entirely, one that accepted instability as a constant rather than an anomaly, one that did not eliminate risk but moved with it, anticipated it, absorbed it. And as the final alerts cleared from her display, leaving only a faint record of what had occurred, she realized that her systems had not failed. They had simply not been built for this kind of environment. "You expected this," she said, turning fully toward him now. Her posture no longer that of superior authority, but something more precise, more focused. Not the exact event, but the pattern. Ethan's hand left the controls, the system now stable enough to maintain itself. And for the first time since the sequence began, he stepped back, returning to his position behind her, as if nothing had changed, as if the last several minutes had been routine. "It is always a pattern," he said, and Lyra's gaze lingered on the console, on the data that now looked clean again, orderly, predictable. And yet she knew that beneath that surface, the system had been something else entirely, something her instruments had not fully captured, something he had recognized without needing confirmation. And that was the difference. Not strength, not resilience in the way her people defined it, but awareness, a constant readiness for the moment when things stopped behaving as expected. "Your species does not wait for certainty," she said, more to herself than to him. And Ethan's reply came softly, almost indistinguishable from the steady hum of the restored systems. "Certainty comes too late." And the chamber fell quiet again, not with the clean silence of controlled conditions, but with something deeper, something earned. And Lyra Vale stood there, looking at the human behind her, and understood that what she had been studying was not a species that survived harsh conditions, but one that had learned to live inside them, without hesitation, without pause, and without needing permission from the universe to keep going. The chamber remained quiet, but it was no longer the kind of silence Lyra Vale trusted. It was not the absence of disturbance, not the engineered calm of controlled systems. It was something layered, something that held the memory of instability beneath its surface, and she could feel it now, even without looking at the data, a faint awareness that the station was not perfectly synchronized, only close enough. And that difference mattered more than she had ever been taught to consider. "Your systems are stabilizing," she said slowly, her eyes scanning the now steady readouts, each value returning to acceptable thresholds, each alert clearing one by one, but not fully corrected. And Ethan Cole stood behind her again, exactly where he had been before, as if the last several minutes had simply returned him to a starting position rather than changed anything at all. "They will hold," he replied, his tone even, not confident in the way of certainty, but in the way of familiarity. And that distinction stayed with her, because he was not claiming perfection, he was recognizing sufficiency. "You accept incomplete resolution," she said, turning slightly, studying him again, this time not as a subject, but as a variable she had failed to model. "You accept risk." Ethan did not move, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, something almost imperceptible, as if the question itself required adjustment. "We accept reality," he said, and the words carried a weight that her training could not easily categorize, because reality, in her world, was something defined, constrained, shaped into predictable outcomes. But here it seemed to mean something else entirely, something less controlled, more immediate. And as she looked back at the display, she noticed it again, the smallest delay in system response, less than 1/10 of a second, barely measurable, but now impossible to ignore, because she knew it was there, and knowing changed everything. "This station was designed to eliminate variables," she said, more to clarify her own understanding than to challenge him, "to ensure that every function operates within precise parameters." Ethan's response came just as quietly as before, but this time there was something beneath it, not emotion, but certainty shaped by experience. "Then it was designed for a place that does not exist." Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in recalibration, because the statement was not inaccurate. It was incomplete, and that incompleteness was what unsettled her. "Every advanced civilization eliminates instability," she said, the words sounding more like a question than a declaration now. and Ethan finally turned his head enough to meet her gaze directly. Every advanced civilization tries. The correction was small, almost insignificant in structure, but its implication was not, because it suggested a limitation her people had never acknowledged, and before she could respond, another fluctuation rippled through the station, subtle again, but distinct, a brief drop in ambient pressure that corrected itself within seconds, too fast for alarm systems to escalate, too small for standard protocols to engage, but not too small for her to feel, not anymore. And she did not look at the data this time. She looked at him, because she already knew what she would see on the display, a minor deviation, non-critical, self-correcting, acceptable, and yet he had already shifted his attention, already adjusted his stance, already anticipating something that had not yet been defined. "It is happening again," she said, her voice lower now, more focused, and Ethan gave a slight nod, not confirming the event, but acknowledging the pattern. "It never stopped," he replied, and the words settled into her understanding with quiet clarity, because this was the difference, not strength, not resilience, but continuity, the awareness that instability was not an interruption, it was a constant, and as the station continued to hum around them, holding together not through perfection, but through continuous adjustment, Lyra Vale realized that she had been asking the wrong question from the beginning. It was not how humans survived a death world. It was how they ever learned to expect anything else. The station no longer felt like a place. It felt like a process, something unfolding moment by moment. And Lyra Vale stood in the center of it with a stillness that was no longer rooted in control, but in observation. Her eyes no longer fixed on the clean lines of data, but drifting between the displays and the subtle cues she had only just begun to recognize. A faint delay in the lighting cycle. A shift in air circulation that arrived a fraction of a second too late. A vibration in the floor that did not match the station's rotation. And for the first time in her career, she allowed those imperfections to exist without immediately correcting them. Because correcting them now felt like misunderstanding them. "Your awareness is continuous," she said quietly, not looking at Ethan Cole as she spoke, her attention divided between the measurable and the sensed. "You do not rely solely on systems." Ethan remained where he was, his presence steady, almost indistinguishable from the environment except for the way he seemed aligned with it rather than separate from it. "Systems are tools," he replied, his voice even. "They are not the world." Lyra absorbed that, the distinction settling into her thoughts with a weight that shifted something fundamental, because her people had always treated systems as extensions of reality, as perfected versions of it. But here, in this moment, she understood that they were approximations at best, and sometimes approximations arrived too late. Another subtle fluctuation passed through the station, a soft dip in the hum, a slight hesitation in the environmental controls, and this time she did not reach for the console. She did not check the display. She simply felt it, recognized it, and then looked to Ethan, who had already adjusted his stance by a few inches, already recalibrated his position in response to something that had not yet fully manifested. "You moved before the event," she said, her tone no longer questioning but confirming. And Ethan gave a small nod. "You move with it," he corrected, and the difference mattered, because it meant he was not predicting from a distance. He was embedded in the sequence itself, part of the unfolding rather than separate from it. And that realization carried a quiet gravity that no data point could replicate. "This environment is controlled," Lyra said, though the words felt less certain now, more like a statement she was testing rather than asserting. It should not require that level of adaptation. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward the transparent wall where the gas giant churned below, its massive storms moving in patterns that defied simple modeling. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a calm that was not dismissive, but grounded. "Control is relative." The lights dimmed again, not fully, just enough to register. And this time Lyra did not wait for the system to report it. She spoke before the display updated. "Power redistribution delay, less than 1 second." Her voice steady, precise, and for a brief moment, something like recognition passed through Ethan's expression, not approval, not surprise, but acknowledgement. "Now you see it," he said, and the words did not feel like instruction. They felt like inclusion, as if she had crossed a threshold she had not known existed, and the realization settled deeper than any previous insight, because this was not about strength or resilience or even survival. It was about perception, about existing in a state where the world was never assumed to be stable, where every moment carried the possibility of change, and where waiting for certainty was not just inefficient, it was dangerous. Your species lives like this, Lyra said, her voice softer now, not diminished, but recalibrated. Constantly aware, constantly adjusting. Ethan did not answer immediately, and in that brief pause the station's hum steadied again, the delays tightening, the systems aligning just enough to restore the illusion of perfection. And when he finally spoke, it was with the same quiet certainty that had defined every word he had said. We do not think about it. And that, more than anything else, unsettled her, because it meant this was not a skill they turned on when needed. It was a state of being, a baseline, something so deeply integrated that it required no conscious effort. And as Lyra Vale stood there, feeling the station settle into its fragile equilibrium, she understood that what she had been witnessing was not adaptation in response to crisis. It was existence shaped by a world where crisis was never truly absent, only waiting, just out of sight, just beyond the next moment. The illusion of stability returned, smooth and quiet, the station's systems aligning just enough to resemble perfection again. And for a moment, everything looked exactly as it was designed to be, lights steady, air balanced, structure holding within optimal tolerances. And yet Lyra Vale no longer trusted it. Not completely, because now she could feel the difference beneath the surface. The subtle tension that had always been there but had gone unnoticed, like a current beneath still water. And she stood in that awareness without reaching for control, without trying to correct what no longer felt like an error but a condition. If instability is constant, she said slowly, her voice measured but no longer anchored in certainty, then your species does not seek to eliminate it. Ethan Cole remained behind her, his posture relaxed but never passive, his attention spread across the chamber in a way that suggested he was always listening, always measuring, even when nothing appeared to demand it. We reduce what we can, he replied, and live with what we cannot. Lyra considered that, the simplicity of the statement contrasting sharply with the complexity of her own frameworks, because her people had always pursued total control, total predictability, the removal of every unknown variable, until the system itself became a closed equation. But here, in this place, she was beginning to understand that some variables did not disappear, they only shifted, adapted, returned in different forms, and the idea of living with that, of accepting it as a baseline rather than a failure, felt both unfamiliar and strangely precise. Another fluctuation moved through the station, softer this time. A slight dimming of ambient light paired with a fractional drop in environmental pressure, and Lyra did not look at the display. She did not need to. Less than half a second delay, she said, her voice steady, non-critical, self-correcting. And Ethan's response came almost immediately. For now. The addition was small, but it carried a weight that reshaped the moment, because it acknowledged something her systems did not, that conditions were not fixed, that what was acceptable now could shift without warning. And Lyra felt that realization settle deeper, not as data, but as understanding. You assume continuation, she said, turning slightly, her gaze no longer searching for flaws but for alignment. You assume that the situation will evolve. Ethan nodded once, a minimal movement, but deliberate. It always does. And the station responded as if to confirm it, a brief cascade of minor alerts flickering across her display, each one individually insignificant, each one resolving before escalation, but together forming a pattern that was no longer invisible to her, a rhythm of adjustment, of constant recalibration, and for the first time she did not see it as inefficiency. She saw it as resilience, not the static kind her people defined, but something dynamic, something that moved, adapted, persisted. Then your strength is not in preventing failure, she said, her voice quieter now, more reflective than analytical, and Ethan's reply came with the same calm certainty that had defined every word he had spoken. Our strength is in what happens next. The chamber fell still again, but it was not the same stillness as before. It carried weight now, context, meaning, and Lyra Vale stood there, looking at the systems she had once trusted without question, and realized that they had never been wrong, only incomplete, because they described a world that could be controlled, not the one that actually existed. And as the station continued its quiet, constant adjustments, holding together not through perfection but through persistence, she understood that the human behind her was not extraordinary in his species, he was typical, and that realization carried a quiet gravity that no data set could fully contain. Because if this was normal for them, then the question was no longer how they survived, but how anything else did. The chamber did not change, and that was the most unsettling part, because everything appeared normal again, the systems aligned, the environment stable, the data clean and reassuring in the way it was designed to be. And yet Lyra Vale no longer saw stability when she looked at it. She saw motion held together by constant correction, a balance maintained not by perfection but by endless adjustment. And she stood there without reaching for control, because control now felt like an illusion she had mistaken for truth. "If this is your normal," she said slowly, her voice quieter but sharper in its focus, "then your species does not experience peace the way others do." Ethan Cole remained still behind her, his presence steady, not imposing, not dominant, but grounded in a way that suggested familiarity with everything she was only beginning to understand. "We do," he replied, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, only a calm certainty that did not depend on the environment being stable. "It just looks different." Lyra turned slightly, studying him again, not as a subject, not even as a variable, but as a reference point, because now she understood that everything she had observed in the last several minutes was not an exception, it was a baseline. "Explain," she said, and this time the word carried no authority, only intent, and Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting toward the transparent wall where the gas giant continued its slow, massive rotation, storms stretching across thousands of miles, each one powerful, unpredictable, and yet part of a larger pattern that persisted over time. "Where I am from," he said finally, his voice low, measured. "Things break, systems fail, conditions change without warning." Another subtle shift moved through the station, a faint vibration beneath their feet, a slight delay in the lighting that followed a fraction of a second later, and Lyra felt it before she saw it, recognized it without needing confirmation, and she did not react. She did not move. She simply acknowledged it. And Ethan continued, "You do not wait for it to stop." His words aligned with the rhythm of the station, with the quiet adjustments happening all around them. "You learn to function inside it." Lyra's gaze returned to the display, not to check it, but to observe it differently, to see the constant micro-adjustments she had once ignored, the small corrections that kept everything aligned just enough to continue. And for the first time, she did not see imperfection, she saw continuity. "Then peace," she said slowly, the concept reshaping itself in her mind, "is not the absence of instability." Ethan gave a slight nod, the movement almost imperceptible. "It is the ability to move through it." And the words settled into the chamber with a quiet finality that no data point could replicate, because they described something her systems could not measure, something that existed beyond optimization and control. And Lyra Vale stood there, feeling the station's subtle, constant motion, the endless sequence of small corrections that kept everything intact, and realized that what she had once defined as imperfection was simply reality, and that the human behind her was not extraordinary for understanding it. He was simply adapted to it, shaped by a world that never promised stability. And as the station continued to hum around them, balanced not by certainty, but by persistence, she understood that the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of meaning, full of recognition, and for the first time since she had spoken to him, she did not ask another question, because she already knew the answer would not come in words. The station held, not perfectly, not in the way Lyra Vale had once defined stability, but in a way that no longer felt fragile, only alive, a constant sequence of adjustments flowing beneath the surface, unseen yet ever present, and she stood in that quiet awareness without reaching for control, without trying to correct what she now understood was not broken, because nothing here was failing, it was simply continuing. And that distinction changed everything. The hum of the system's steady but no longer absolute. The lights consistent but not flawless, the air balanced but always shifting. And for the first time, she did not measure it against an ideal. She accepted it as it was. Your world, she said softly, her voice carrying less authority and more understanding, never gave you stability. Ethan Cole remained behind her, as he had been from the beginning, unchanged in posture, unchanged in presence. And yet everything about him felt different now, not because he had changed, but because she had. No, he replied, calm, simple, certain. It did not. Lyra's gaze drifted to the vast storm below, the gas giant turning in slow, relentless motion, its atmosphere a constant collision of forces that never settled, never paused, and yet persisted, enduring in its own way without needing to become still. And she saw the connection now, not as metaphor, but as truth. And you learned to exist within that. She continued, not asking, not analyzing, simply stating what had become clear, without waiting for it to become safe. Ethan did not answer immediately. And in that pause the station shifted again, a minor delay in system response, a fractional dimming of light, something that would have once drawn her full attention, demanded correction, demanded control, but now it passed through her awareness without urgency, acknowledged and released. And when he spoke, his voice was as steady as ever. If you wait for safe, you do not move. The words settled into the space between them, not heavy, not dramatic, just true. And Lyra Vale felt something align within her understanding, not a conclusion, not a final answer, but a shift, a recalibration of how she defined strength. Because strength was not in eliminating risk, not in creating perfect systems, but in continuing forward. When perfection did not exist, and she turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge his presence without needing to see him directly, because she no longer needed visual confirmation to understand what stood behind her. Then your species, she said quietly, her voice carrying a clarity that had not been there before, does not survive because it is protected. Ethan's response came without pause, without emphasis, as if the answer had always been there, waiting to be recognized. We survive because we do not stop. And the station continued its quiet motion around them, systems adjusting, environment shifting, everything in a state of constant, imperfect balance. And for the first time, Lyra did not seek to define it, did not reduce it to data or models or controlled outcomes. She simply observed it. And in that observation, she understood something her people had never needed to consider. That stability was not the absence of change, it was the ability to endure it. And as the lights steadied once more, as the hum of the station settled into its continuous rhythm, she did not speak again, because there was nothing left to question, only something to carry forward, a realization that would follow her beyond this chamber, beyond this station, into every negotiation, every system, every assumption she had once held as absolute. And behind her, Ethan Cole stood in silence, unchanged, unremarkable by his own standards. And that, more than anything else, was what stayed with her, because if this was what normal looked like for his kind, then the galaxy had never truly understood what it meant to be human.